Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and as we approach the spookiest of months, I figured I'd make something extra spooky, and what's spookier than a skeleton? Well, how about a skeleton with 3 heads, no arms or legs, and it's summoned by putting a decapitated head on a block of sand with faces. Of course, to really up the spooky ante, I want it to light up, which I'll do with this stuff. The plan is to embed the little light in the center of a skull so that it lights up the mouth, eyes, and nose, casting an eerie blue glow. First thing first though, I'll clip the tip so that the light disperses a little bit better, then I can stick in a lump of plain old gray clay before covering the LED in a head-sized ball of translucent clay. Then, once it's been baked, the clay is sort of a sickly, ghostly white. However, once you turn the light on, the entire surface lights up with a nice, bright blue glow. Then I can start building up the rest of the skull by layering more clay on top of the translucent clay until it's fully encased before whittling it back to make my skull. Since the clay underneath is cured already, it's easy enough to dig through the topmost layer until the translucent stuff is visible beneath. I'll make sure to block out the larger sections like the eyes, mouth, and nose before moving on to refining the shape and adding the detail. I'm trying to follow the shape of a normal skull as best I can, but with the wiring sticking out the bottom and the way the base layer of clay needs to be built in order to maximize light diffusion, the jawline is a bit rounder than I'd like. Sadly, this means that the floating tri-headed limbless skeletal monster may not be entirely anatomically correct. I hope you can forgive me. Otherwise, with the overall head shape heading towards the correct shape, I'll add some spooky skeletal teeth to the jawline, give the surface a quick brush with isopropyl alcohol to remove any fingerprints, then toss it in the oven to cure. I want to mount the body on a longer length of wire, so I'm going to pull the current miniature spinal cord out and then drill a new hole for a slightly thicker gauge of wire. And if you listen closely, you'll be able to hear the exact moment I drilled into the wiring and tore the prongs off the back, destroying the LED. Fortunately, it shouldn't be too hard to replace the light after the fact by drilling a large hole so that I can pull out the ruined wires and as much of the old LED as I can, then filling in the big hole with some sticky Cosclay and jamming some new LEDs all up in his head guts. A quick test tells me that my lights are working again and I can fill in the offending hole, stick on my new wire, and then through the tried, tested, and proven method of slamming things on my desk, I can give my elongated aluminium spine some happy little arms. Then a couple more slams and I can top the arms with some more skulls. I made these heads in the exact same way, and for continuity's sake I made sure to drill too deep into the base of the skull and destroy the lights as well before replacing them with new bulbs. Then I can string my wires together, solder them to some longer lengths, wrap them in a little heat shrink so they don't short out, then run those lengths down my spine and out the bottom. Then I'll give my wither a little spooky scoliosis before building up a thin layer of clay over the surface to cover the armature and any of the wiring. Once I've got full clay coverage, I'll use some clay shapers to cut some spooky vertebrae into my spooky spinal column, and then use the flat edge of a sculpting tool to give them a bit of a spooky spinal shape. To make the ribcage, I'm going to wrap some thin wire around the spine and pull it so snug that it muffin tops the vertebrae, then I can snip them to the correct length. Then it's just a case of wrapping little long wormy dealies along the lengths of the ribs and squashing them flat so that they look like ribs, I guess. Then I can fill in the offending vertebral gaps, join the ribs to the spinal column, and gently bend them into shape. To zhuzh up the top of the rib cage, I've added little spooky clavicle as well as some spooky connectors between the heads, then I'll add some little strips of clay between the ribs and in random spots around the rib cage because I think it looks cool. With the ribs looking spooky, that's the majority of the work finished and 3-headed Andy is ready for his final bake. However, once I'd taken him out, I thought his underlying translucent clay base was a bit too noticeable, so I'm gonna file it back using a Dremel. I'm also quite happy to report that I managed to do this without popping the LEDs again, which means it's time to paint him. Before I do any painting though, I'm gonna mask off his eyes and mouth using some sticky tack. This way I can slap on a white primer all willy-nilly without having to worry about priming over his translucent facial bits. I decided a very dark purple would be perfect here because very dark purple is one of the spookiest colors. It's not a coincidence that so many of my monsters are purple. It is a scientific fact that purple is the scariest color. I'll follow my spooky purple with an equally spooky lighter purple dry brush, then to give a little contrast to the face, I'll paint his teeth white-ish. Finally, I can pull the sticky tack off, revealing the unblemished, beautiful translucent clay base beneath. Now at this point my wither is finished, but I feel like he needs a base, and what would be a better base than the very soul sand that he is summoned forth from. I want my sand to be a cube, but I need space to store the wiring in the battery pack, so I'm going to make the base of the base out of this perfectly sized cardboard box that's been sitting in my box waiting for just this moment. With it cut down to size, I'll paint the exterior with a thin coat of bacon bond to help my clay adhere, then I'll smash out a flat sheet of clay. I'll attach the box onto this, then cut off any of the excess, and repeat this process until all my sides are covered in a thin sheet of clay. Then I can start adding the faces. Now if I were a better man, I would painstakingly sculpt 100 highly detailed screaming skeletal faces, but I'm kind of a turd, so instead I'm just going to make a whole bunch of not good, but good enough skeleton faces and really lean into that quantity over quality style. After all, this is really just some extra flavor, so ideally you're not going to be paying too much attention to it anyways. Imagine, if you will, that all the love and attention I gave to sculpting the first wither face, I did here as well, but spread it over a much larger surface and significantly more faces. Eventually though, I've got enough faces with just enough detail, so the finishing touch will be jabbing the surface with a stiff bacon bond covered brush to make it look a little sandier, then it's into the oven for a quick bake, and I can give it a nice white base coat. To paint my screaming face cube, I'll start with a dark brown base coat, allowing the paint to pool in all the recesses for that extra shading, then I'll tickle the tips of all the faces with a heavy khaki dry brush. Originally I had toyed with the idea of hiding the wiring for the LEDs behind some kind of smoke, but I didn't really think it fit with the wither design, so instead I've just wrapped the wires in some black shrink tubing so that it isn't as noticeable. Then I can run the wire through the hole in the faces, attach my wire to a battery pack, then, that's kind of it, and we're on to the Glamour Shots. As always, a big old thank you to the most beautiful people on the internet, my lovely patrons, and a very special shout out to my newest patrons, Allison Atberry, Evil Pirate, Luke Edwards, Bad Wasabi, CM Harris, Tristan Lavery, Ren, Grimmelgruff, Captain Catbeard, Natalie Richards, Happy Anniversary Susan, Rob Mullins, Augie and Teddy, and Milo the Boo Boo Butt. You are the floating spinal column that keeps this three-headed monstrosity of a channel afloat. If you like this video, then maybe consider subscribing. We're not far off that 1 million subscriber count, and if we can hit that milestone, then, I don't actually think anything really happens. But I'll tell you what, if we hit 1 million subscribers before the end of the year, then I promise that I will